Good evening. I'm Father Claude Pevor. I am an associate editor at the Institute for Advanced Jesuit Studies, and I mostly translate Latin of the early Jesuits. And I am here, delightfully, to introduce Yasmin Haskell, and I would like to read a little introduction for her. Yasmin is a Casamarca Foundation Chair in Latin Humanism at the University of Western Australia at Perth. And she is Chief Investigator in the Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence for the History of Emotions, Europe, 1100 to 1800. Though she trained as a classicist, her research and writing has been chiefly in early modern literary and intellectual history and the classical tradition. After her doctorate from the University of Sydney, 1996, she held a series of research fellowships in Cambridge, UK, before returning to Australia in 2003. Her research spans Neo-Latin studies, Latin literature written since the Renaissance, reception of classical authors, history of psychiatry and emotions, and of course, early modern Society of Jesus. In the Center of Excellence for the History of Emotions, she leads research teams and projects working on Jesuit emotions and passions for learning. And there is a website that you can find that at. Her first book, Loyola's Bees, Ideology and Industry in Jesuit Latin Didactic Poetry, published by Oxford in 2003, a British Academy and Oxford University Press, was a winner of the British Academy Postdoctoral Monographs Competition. She has also co-edited, inter alia, volumes on humanism and medicine in the early modern period, and Latinity and Alterity in the early modern period, as well as a critical edition with commentary of Charles-Alphonse Dufresnoy's 17th century poem on painting, De Arte Graphica, for Droz. More recently, she has edited a widely reviewed collection, Diseases of the Imagination and Imaginary Disease in the Early Modern Period, Turnhout Breppel's 2011. And she's explored the contexts in which Latin continued to be used during the Enlightenment, prescribing Ovid, the Latin works and networks of the enlightened Dr. Herkens, published by Bloomsbury of London in 2013. Yasmin has been a visiting fellow at All Souls and Christ Church Colleges, Oxford, and in 2013 to 14 at Trinity College, Cambridge. She was elected Fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities in both the Classics and Modern Languages divisions in 2013. We have enjoyed hearing from Yasmin many times during this conference, but we're especially happy to welcome her to the speaker's podium.
Thank you very much, Claude. And I'd just like to say again, reiterate my thanks to the organizers, to Robert, and of course to Maureen for the administrative arrangements, but a special thanks to Claude and to the Jesuits at St. Mary's residence for helping me find the biscuits and other important things. Okay, now I'm not a Mac user, so I hope this all goes well. During waves of expulsion from Portugal, Spain, France, and their overseas territories beginning in 1759, through to decommissioning of the society by the Garganelli Pope Clement XIV in 1773, the Jesuits were exposed to intensifying ridicule of their religious positions, their way of proceeding at home and abroad, and even of their enviable educational system. Of course, Jesuits had been the target of satire and opprobrium from their inception, and of course, not even exclusively in Protestant countries. But the avalanche of anti-Jesuitica that gathered momentum over the course of the second half of the 18th century was unprecedented. In French pamphlets of the period, Jesuits were portrayed as conspirators and regicides, and later, ironically, as counter-revolutionaries, as profiteering hypocrites, devil worshippers and corrupters of youth who get their comeuppance falling off towers, passing through sieves of true piety and tumbling to hell to be welcomed by demons. Unfortunately, I haven't got an image to show you, but I will show you a couple of slides of more sympathetic engravings showing groups of humiliated, distraught, and sometimes frail and elderly priests assembling at ports before embarking for exile. Now, while the history of the suppression is the focus of an increasingly rich and sophisticated body of modern scholarship, especially from national and/or colonial perspectives, there has been surprisingly little work devoted specifically and synoptically to the emotional impact on Jesuits living through these turbulent times, and to how they managed, individually and collectively, their changing religious identities, their scholarly careers, and their mental health. In a new project, in collaboration with a team at the Ludwig Boltzmann Institute for Neo-Latin Studies in Austria, I'm hoping to begin to fill that gap by considering the twilight of the old Society of Jesus through a unique and, I think, highly revealing prism. That of the Jesuits' literary production, especially in Latin, over the period leading up to and immediately after the suppression. Via a series of case studies of Jesuit writers anticipating or living through the long era of the suppression, mainly in Italy, but also in Austria, Germany, and Eastern Europe, we're aiming to build up a much more comprehensive picture than hitherto available of their literary works, networks, and of the emotional freight conveyed by them in different stages and places. Frustration, rage, defiance, nostalgia, consolation, hope, melancholy, and despair. The title of our project is a bit cheesy, but we've put in a research grant application to the Australian Research Council, so cross our fingers, is Writing Resilience, Languages and Literature of the Jesuit Suppression. Not only do we hope to illuminate the role played by Latin literary culture in the emotional management of the private and collective trauma that was the suppression of the Society of Jesus for its members, but our project will also serve effectively as the first global reconnaissance of the Neo-Latin writings of the suppression Jesuits, identifying common themes as well as local, regional, and national variations. In her pioneering anthology of Jesuit Latin poetry, for example, the late André Thiel did not include works published after 1730, holding that Neo-Latin poetry in general, and that of the Jesuits in particular, entered a period of decadence after the golden age of the 17th century. Our project will vigorously challenge that assumption and document the awareness and reception of 16th and 17th century Jesuit Latin literature by their 18th century brothers. So, what I'm offering you today in this lecture is really just a record of my very tentative first steps on a much longer journey. It's in fact probably false advertising even to call it work in progress. It's work to be begun. Okay, I hardly need remind anybody in this audience of how much the Society of Jesus had contributed to European science, art, music, literature, and theatre for over 2 centuries since their founding in 1540. Along with the order, the Latin humanist education which had prevailed in Europe since the Renaissance suffered a near-fatal blow in the final decades of the 18th century, and I think that their fates are more or less intertwined. In France especially, the secondary education offered in Jesuit colleges rooted in creative imitation of the ancient classics, and we've heard about this from so many of our speakers at the conference, was vociferously attacked by the philosophes, most famously, of course, by d'Alembert in his article Collège in the Encyclopédie. And although d'Alembert and Voltaire were shocked by the violence of the anti-Jesuit genie that they had conspired to let out of the bottle in France, d'Alembert belatedly realized that they were at least better than the Jansenists, Frederick II's response, I'm sorry, that's the slide. Frederick II's response to d'Alembert in May 1774 to a letter from the philosophe reveals a bemusement at the depth of d'Alembert's ideological rancour. And he says, "Can such bile have a place in the heart of the true sage? The poor Jesuits would exclaim if they knew how you express yourself about them in your letter. I didn't protect them at all when they were powerful. In their adversity, I see them only as men of letters who would be very difficult to replace for the education of our youth. It's for this precious end that I find them necessary, since of all the Catholic clergy in our country, they are the only ones who apply themselves to letters." To what extent did this Latin humanist education of the Jesuits serve as a life raft for them during the suppression? Not just in the most obvious sense that it served them it afforded them a living in the territories of Frederick II of Prussia and Catherine the Great in Russia as teachers of Latin literature, but also as a vehicle for expressing their feelings about the suppression, both to one another and to the wider republic of Latin letters. Was Latin humanism cultivated consciously by suppression Jesuits as a point of pride and solidarity, if not Jesuit distinctiveness? Okay, to our sources, and we'll start with the most obvious. During the roughly 30-year period, 1759 to 89, which is the historical focus of my talk today, many ex- and exiled Jesuits wrote Latin letters or prose diaries or histories of their own and the order's troubles. The most famous of these, of course, was Giulio Cesare Cordara's Commentari de Suppressione, conveniently translated by Father John Murphy. But at Arsi this Easter, I was fortunate to be introduced by Sabina Pavone to the manuscript of José Cairio's De Exilio Provinciarum Transmarinarum Assistentia Lusitana ex Societatis Jesus, so an account of the exiles from the transmarine provinces of the Lusitanian Society. And Cairo, incidentally, also produced an account of the exile of the Portuguese Jesuits from Portugal. And I agree with Sabina that Cairo's account of the expulsion of these Jesuits from those returning to Italy from Brazil, Maranhão, and Goa, is particularly fascinating because although he was not one of their number, Cairo represents events transpiring in the colonies as if he had witnessed these things firsthand. He channels, if you like, the personal emotional experience of the ultramarine exiles. But this isn't... where's my water? Sorry. This isn't a transparent document. It's not a video recording of the exile, the transmarine exiles. The rhetorical aspects of this text, which remained in manuscript until the 20th century, and also for that matter of Cordara's, strike me as being inadequately explored. And indeed, the significance of their being in Latin. Of course, we mustn't jump to conclusions about these Jesuit authors' choice of Latin. As I argued in my recent book on the Dutch physician, Latin poet, and 18th century grand tourist, Gerard Nicolaas Herkens, who incidentally visited Cordara in Rome in 1759, just as all hell was about to break loose for the society. As I argued there, Latin could be used in this period to reach an international public, obviously, but also to target much more intimate audiences. And hopefully we'll have time to return to that later. Okay, what of Latin poetry? My collaborator, Florian Schaffenrath, has already made preliminary soundings of a Latin epic written by a former Jesuit living in Russia, Nicodemus Musnicki, on Christ's return from hell, 1805, which is in fact an allegory for the death and suppression of the Jesuit order that looks hopefully to its resurrection. Of course, not all poetry written by suppression Jesuits was directly about the suppression, but I suggest that a lot of it would repay more thorough investigation for, as it were, suppressed emotions. For example, from the middle of the 18th century, Jesuit poets in Italy produced long scientific poems, a genre especially dear to my heart, on subjects from acoustics to eclipses to electricity to Newtonian physics, effectively demonstrating Enlightenment values both to one another and to the wider world. So in this slide, you have an illustration from Giuseppe Maria Mazzolari's Electricorum Libri 6 books on electricity, and the fellow in this stamp on the top right-hand corner is, of course, Roger Boscovich, the great Jesuit physicist of the Collegio Romano, who was also a Latin poet. So it seems that the 1760s was the most fertile decade for the publication of Lucretian-style scientific poems by fellows of the Collegio Romano. And these, of course, were the very years in which the suppression was unfolding across Portugal, Spain, and France. I'm exploring the possibility that the construction of a cosmic sublime in these poems was in part a response to, or perhaps even an escape from, contemporary events, troubling contemporary events on a more worldly plane. On the eve of the suppression, Mazzolari, professor of rhetoric at the Roman College, poet of the electricity poem, in the 6th book of that poem, he devoted much space to celebrating the humanistic and scientific achievements of his contemporary Italian Jesuit brothers. Perhaps he was beginning to feel the noose tightening. But he was not just a scientific poet, he was also a highly acclaimed stylist and promoter of Latin prose. And in our project, we hope to dig deeper into the writings of the suppression Jesuits for evidence of their responses to contemporary attacks, not just on their order, but on the Latin language itself as a medium for international literary and scientific exchange. The Croatian Jesuit and scientific poet Bernardo Zamagna, for example, he wrote poems on acoustics and on the airship, passionately defended Latin's role as the universal language of the Republic of Letters. It shouldn't be assumed, however, that suppression Jesuits everywhere were advocates for Latin language and literature. We always need to set their Latin works in the context of their vernacular writing and the literary translations, a genre in which many were also prolific. And we need to gauge their commitment to their respective national literatures. In the eastern part of the Habsburg monarchy, modern Hungary, Slovakia, and Croatia, Jesuits fragmented into different networks with sometimes opposing agendas, which my colleague Lav Subaric will explore. And while many ex-Jesuits remained loyal to Latin, others embraced the new ethno-linguistic Hungarian identity and associated program of nationalization and de-Latinization of culture and society. Others still became propagandists of enlightened absolutism and Germanization. Be that as it may, some of the most enduring works by 18th century Ibero-American writers were written in Latin when their Jesuit authors fetched up in Italy after their expulsion from the overseas colonies. Two of the best-known examples are Rafael Landiva's 15-book epic didactic poem on the nature and culture of Mexico, a sort of love letter to his lost homeland, and Diego Abad's massive philosophical theological epic On God and the God-Man, which was much admired by his contemporaries. The prodigious Latinity of the Mexicans caused consternation among some of their Italian brethren, and nothing short of a turf war broke out between the Italian Jesuit cultural commentator and poet Giambattista Roberti and Diego Abad over the supposed defects of Mexican Latin style vis-a-vis the Latin of the Italians. At the same time, former Jesuits from Old Spain were moved to defend the honour of their national Latinity by citing ancient Roman writers of Spanish descent, such as Seneca and Lucan. However, while much exciting new work is underway on the literary output of the Spanish and Spanish-American exiles, the Portuguese and Brazilian dimension has been less well explored. And so I come finally to our hero for today, the Portuguese Manuel de Azevedo, who was one of only a few Jesuits admitted to the familiar circle of the enlightened Lambertini pontiff, Benedict XIV. Born in 1713 into a noble family in Coimbra, he seems to have exhibited a precocious piety while still a schoolboy. He wrote a treatise on the examination of conscience for schoolboys, which pleased his Jesuit teachers so much they had it printed for the use of the students at Évora and Lisbon. I'm not sure how much it would have it pleased his classmates. Azevedo entered the society in 1728. He taught humanities at the College of St. Anthony in Lisbon, where he composed a Latin play that was apparently performed in front of King John. The public conclusiones he held as professor of rhetoric at Évora were published in 1740 in 48 folio pages as Poeticae Facultatis Amphitheatrum, and evince an exuberant late Baroque ingenuity and facility with multiple languages. And this is a theme that we will see later. But look at the image on the right there. It's not very enlightened, perhaps. This was actually republished in 1781 in Venice as Ars Poetica in 2 volumes in a more economical format. And it's got a fascinating preface talking about vernacular literature. It's dedicated to Catherine the Great. Azevedo appears to have been called to Rome by the Jesuit general shortly after 1740 and made an impression there in Rome for his talents and learning, not least on the Pope, whose collected works he meticulously edited. He also published various works in Latin on the Catholic liturgy and saints, which I pass over, but I will just mention his verse Fasti Antoniani, his verse life of St. Anthony of Padua, which apparently has had a long reception, 6 books in 1786 and then 12 in 1789, accompanied by a prose biography. This late work was composed after Azevedo had been exiled from Rome to the Veneto. I must confess that I haven't yet been able to reconstruct the full details of Azevedo's career, but it evidently took a turn for the worse during the years leading up to the suppression. And I was very frustrated that when I was in Rome at Easter, I wasn't able to get to Reggio Emilia before this conference to investigate a miscellany of documents which I discovered when I was rooting around in the Biblioteca Angelica just before the bell rang on Good Friday. And of course, in this miscellany of documents, whose existence I discovered in a footnote to a rare early 20th century edition of Cordara's correspondence, collected by Azevedo's friend Francesco Carrara, there are numerous letters, and there is a fascicle Copia di carte relative al processo per immoralità intentato al padre Emanuele d'Azevedo in 1768, Well, I received this bundle of documents about his trial for immorality. I'm afraid too late to do anything about them for this conference, so stay tuned. So we go back to Cordara, who has in any case left us a tantalizing vignette towards the end of his the sixth book of his commentary on his age and on the occasion, the decline of the Society of Jesus. And he says, besides these, there was Azevedo, Portuguese, who was very much in the Pope's good books, for various reasons, but especially because he had taken great care to publish Benedict's works, no less sumptuously than elegantly, at his own expense. For Azevedo was extremely rich and influential in the city, and he was also a good sort, not good-looking, with almost no sophistication in his manner, completely unconcerned with his dress and appearance, but for some reason so hated by Jesuits of his own nation that through a covert conspiracy they brought it about that he, even though he was one of the few admitted to the Pope's inner circle, was nevertheless ordered by the Pope to leave the city as an exile at the behest of the King of Portugal. Now, as I mentioned, Azevedo was sent into exile in the Veneto sometime in the early 1760s, and it's there that he published a verse description of the city in 12 long books, about which I was talking to Paul the other day. The preliminary verses to that work suggest it was composed around 1760, but publication deferred for some 20 years. In the same year, 1780, Azevedo published a selection of Latin translations from Italian sonnets. The Italian note to the reader of this volume is very revealing, and he says, "A certain person in whom literary taste and kindness of spirit are marvelously matched persuaded me, and I could say almost forced me, to render into Latin verse some of the more celebrated Italian sonnets, making clear to me that he needed them to be done and with great care. This pressure, however, was nothing but an invention of his and emblematic of his most heartfelt friendship. Nearly 10 years had passed since I was engaged in affairs very different from those which beckon one to the pleasant pursuits of the muses. When my heart was struck by the bitter misfortunes of some of my dearest friends, I found myself overwhelmed by great afflictions and vexed by painful thoughts. I applied myself to serious studies, to composing dissertations and reading learned books, to distract my afflicted mind, since the help of my fellows proved futile. But in vain. He knew that for the saints a quarter of an hour of mental prayer was enough to restore serenity to the soul. He knew that the moral philosophers prescribed other remedies to calm it, but not all medicines are suited to all complexions. Cristiano. So he therefore tried to occupy my imagination with Latin verses, and in 4 months he succeeded in getting me to compose 4 books on the city of Venice. I can't pretend I didn't derive some relief from the new activity, but then new misadventures befell other friends of mine, etc. So you get the picture. Okay, so far then, we've seen Azevedo turning to Latin verse to distract himself from the painful emotions of the suppression. However, my interest in this author was initially sparked because of a tip-off from a friend in Cambridge, Maya filed tomes, who had found a reference in a very old article about exiled Chilean Jesuits to un volume di versi in cui si cantano le disavventure della Compagnia di Gesù, a volume of verses in which are sung the misadventures, not the right word, but you know what I mean, of the Company of Jesus. And it's to this work, which I happily, if not miraculously, rediscovered after a bit of creative Googling, that I shall turn for the remainder of the paper. Well, I say work, but in fact we're dealing with 2 distinct works. published together in 1789 under the title Four Books of Heroic Verse, Heroum Libri Quatuor, and Letters to Heroes, Ad Heroas. The title page says it's Louvain, but Sommervogel says it was actually printed in Italy. The volume is dedicated to General Potemkin, Catherine the Great's former lover and trusted confidant and minister. After a rousing and jubilant verse letter of dedication, thanking the Russians for protecting the Jesuits, Azevedo announces in a candid statement in prose, which is not quite a formal preface, "The poems I have published here may be called books of Tristia." The author explains that he would never have written or exposed his Latin verses to scrutiny of the public had he not felt the need to assuage the grief which had oppressed him since hearing of the expulsion of his Portuguese brothers from their lands. And so here it is then that Azevedo really only first enunciates the source of the painful emotions to which he adverted in a more roundabout way in that volume of sonnets. Azevedo also divulges in this revealing personal note that he had himself suffered displacement from Rome to Venice at the instigation of the Marquis of Pombal, and he tells us that he wrote that description of the city as his first attempt at poetic consolation, and that other works were either freshly composed or revived from juvenile notes so that he could lull unpleasant cares with more useful ones. It is, however, he says, the present collection which deserves the special title of Tristia because it concerns an exile and is addressed to exiles. Now, given this prima facie generic alignment with Ovid, it is somewhat surprising that the printed title of Azevedo's volume is not Tristia, but in fact, Heroum Libri and Epistolae ad Heroas, books of heroic verse, of heroes. Indeed, the first part of the volume is taken up with a scarcely known four-book epic poem on the return of the Jesuits from the American missions. The second, longer part comprises 25 letters to heroes, again, mainly exiled Jesuits, written in a mixture of hexameters and elegiacs. The heroic voice thus competes on several levels throughout this poetry, throughout the collection, with the elegiac voice, the exilic voice. And I would like to take this opportunity to proclaim, but perhaps I'm preaching to the converted here, that Neo-Latin verse is a much underestimated resource for historians of emotion in general and for Jesuit historians in particular. The working assumption of our project, hardly news to Neo-Latinists, but perhaps worth reiterating for the benefit of emotion historians and modern linguists, is that classical style, Latin, could be the vehicle for articulating sincere and complex emotions, belying the frequent association of epilinguistic idioms with cerebrality, impersonality, and stereotypicality. Indeed, I would venture that by exploiting the genres and tropes of ancient literature, our 18th century Jesuit writers found the tools to express and manage their modern emotions with as much authenticity as, and perhaps even more precision and subtlety than when they wrote in the vernacular. I can see that's going to be that's going to be a bone of contention with some. Okay, returning to Azevedo, I'm afraid I won't have time to touch on the epic poem, but in some ways the verse letters are even more fascinating and revealing. The 25 letters to heroes run in date from the 1760s and document the author's lived experience of the suppression in Italy. Although, of course, in their published form, they are delivered well after the final blow of 1773. And I haven't yet located any manuscripts. If they exist, I can't wait to get back to Italy and have a little sniff around. The collection as it is printed is not in strict date order. It's been arranged for rhetorical effect. The first letter dated 1783, is addressed to Azevedo's beloved brothers living in the dominions of the Empress of Russia by miraculous divine providence. And one might assume that the opening letter was penned last as a de facto dedication for the entire collection. But in fact, the final 3 letters of the collection, numbers 23 to 25, are dated later still. They run to 1785, and even these aren't arranged in strict date order, or at least of original composition. Parenthetically, it's interesting to note that the majority of the letters are dated the calends, that is the first day of their given month. I wonder, was this an artificial fix by Azevedo because he couldn't recall the exact dates of composition? Or does this recurring date suggest that the writing of the letters was a sort of regular diary-keeping exercise for him, born perhaps out of a distinctively Jesuit instinct for record-keeping or a sort of Ignatian examination of conscience? Even though the opening poem is not Azevedo's first or last penned letter, it can't, of course, at the front of the volume, not set the tone and the generic expectations for the collection. Its opening couplet, "Small book, you will go to Hyperborean cities where I, alas, may not go, parvus hyperboreas sine me liberibis in urbes, hei mihi quo domino non licet ire tuo," immediately establishes the poet's sad Ovidian voice. And of course, I'm sorry, I have the Latin. I hope you can read it. Azevedo's, and look at the right, Ovid Tristia. It's a very obvious recollection. And it's a paradox because Azevedo is in exile in Italy, writing to more fortunate friends who are actually paradoxically living in wintry lands. So it's a sort of a reverse Ptolemy conceit. He says he would rather join his comrades in those regions where an ample harvest of great men is at hand, but he's too old for such immense labours, having already completed 9 lustra, which of course is 45 years, and rather humbling. This retrospectively programmatic letter, like many in the collection, is both lamenting and triumphant, and the poet mobilises a nautical metaphor for the fate of the society, which we will see is a favourite. It at once recalls Ovid's singular journey into exile, but also, of course, the epic sea journeys of Jesuits past and present, and including his epic poem, and you can, I won't read the Latin, but a kindly right hand spared you the communal shipwreck and kept your small boat afloat. A kindly hand indeed, but the Almighty himself makes the boat strong, blessing us with his aid. And the image is actually from Tanner. It's a bit cheeky. It's the other Azevedo, Ignatius Azevedo, and the Jesuits being tossed overboard by Calvinists. In another poem, he memorably describes the exiles from Santa Fe de Bogotá being dispatched to Italy from Corsica in boats so cramped that they resembled pieces of rotting fruit in a basket. And I'm overjoyed to discover Azevedo because apart from being such an interesting historical witness to his time, he's also a jolly good Latin poet, which would not necessarily be the case. The Ovidian verse letter form allows Azevedo to confess his private suffering in the context of the travails of his brothers in exile. At various points in the collection, the self-deprecating and solipsistic Ovidian persona functions as a mask for Azevedo, with which he can both conceal and cautiously reveal his personal weakness, even a sense of spiritual unworthiness which recurs. But it's also a way that it also serves as a conduit for the expression of a more righteous collective grievance. Now, of course, the Ovidian verse epistle had long been a favoured form for imitation by Jesuits, especially the Heroides, the letters from abandoned heroines, originally classical pagan heroines, but of course the genre was Christianized in the Renaissance and became a favourite with the Jesuits, and I can point to Joost Eijkmeyer's recent book. But the suppression of the society provided an arguably unparalleled opportunity for the rewriting of Ovid's letters from exile, the Tristia and Epistolae ex Ponto. Those poems are an obvious template for exploring the emotions of the suppression, with its geographical dislocations, its lingering taint of disgrace and humiliation, its accumulating privations, and of course the papal brief, Dominus ac Redentor, paralleling in some way Augustus's banishment univocally of Ovid. Whether or not Azevedo's letters ever reached their destinatees, or perhaps only did so belatedly in this final printed version, his use of the Ovidian genre would surely have been personally therapeutic for him. And of course, he's already told us that he's been encouraged to keep himself busy to write poetry by concerned friends. By adopting the Ovidian epistolary form, moreover, he was connecting virtually not just with his contemporary confrères, but with the order's literary history, with the poets who had gone before and celebrated its former glories. Ovid is not the only point of reference in these letters. They're extremely rich. I've found allusions to plenty of other classical authors, even Renaissance Latin poets. And the literary identification of Azevedo with Ovid isn't as obvious and, as it were, in your face, as it is, for example, in Laurent Lebrun's 17th century Ovidius Christianus, where the French 17th century poet pens missionary letters to the old France from the new to applaud the achievements of the Jesuit missionaries to the Canadian Aborigines. Azevedo's poems are not ingenious literary rhetorical exercises, nor propaganda from a distance, but I think a genuine attempt at processing the events and emotions of the suppression from within. And so the classical poets and models serve as tools with which Azevedo thinks through, manages, redirects, if not sublimates his emotions and those of his confrères, because a major theme of the letters is in fact consolation of and advice to his fellow Jesuits, and that of course is a point of difference with Ovid. So here's another example of Azevedo's use of Ovid from the beginning of the fourth letter on leaving the friends with whom he once lived in Portugal after he travelled to visit them from Venice to Bologna. And you can see that from the opening lines, he is referencing Ovid's Tristia 1:3. When the sweetest image of that night occurs to me, on which I was able to be with my friends, when I recall that night on which I left so many things dear to me, a sweet pain strikes my wounded heart. Suavissima imago in Azevedo, in Ovid, tristissima noctis imago, a very sad image. The poem is a poignant, extended meditation on the pain of separation from the friends with whom Azevedo has been briefly reunited in Italy. He consoles himself with the fact that they were originally separated from him by their joyful embrace of the missionary life. And one day we will all be joined in our heavenly fatherland. Mutual love links us in an eternal bond. So the tears of the self-pitying Ovid are ultimately overwritten in this poem by a celebration of the sweetness of friendship, the knowledge that the Jesuits are united in a true and not a profane love that is not impaired by physical distance. In the short space of this paper, probably it seems like the long space of this paper to you, but not much longer, I can't really paint a sufficiently vivid picture of the play of dark and light throughout the collection, the varying of moods, the blending sometimes of different emotions within the space of a single poem. I mean, it is an absolute treasure trove. Some of the letters are addressed to individuals, others to groups. Some are more personal and domestic in orientation and solicit the health and company of the poet's closest friends. In these, the Ovid of the love poetry often competes with that of the Ovid of the exile, imparting an almost erotic intensity to the emotions of pious friendship, although, of course, those sentiments are not unusual in male correspondence of the 18th century, which of course was, but it's interesting to wonder to what extent the Jesuits participated in an 18th century culture of sensibility. Another group of letters is more devotional and commemorates the sites of Catholic and especially Jesuit cult, miracles and festivals. In the very long penultimate letter, presented under his Arcadian name of Nicander Jaseus, Azevedo recounts the sorrows of the Blessed Virgin and exhorts himself to share in her endless suffering, to be unstinting in his tears. It would be artificial, however, to separate these timeless devotional poems from the more mundane ones, recounting and lamenting more recent and worldly events. So the poem on the sorrows of the Blessed Virgin opens again with a nautical simile. I tend to see Lucretius under every bed. I can't help but think this is a bit like the opening to the second book of the De Rerum Natura, like a ship shaken on a stormy sea when a wild sky is threatening. It's certainly very sublime, and the turbulent air grows dark. Not otherwise, afflicted mother, you feel the cruel storms in your rent breast, tossed in a never-ending whirlpool of sorrows, while you grieve to see your sweet son, your child, having suffered so many insults, with the nation seething, raging all around him. I think it's hardly a stretch to see the son for which Mary grieves as a metaphor for the society of Jesus. Azevedo's tears for Mary, then, are also sublimated tears for the sufferings of his brothers in exile. But again, they are paradoxically sweet tears because the passion of the society is sanctioned by providence and holds the promise of its future resurrection. In another poem, Azevedo praises the youth of the Lusitanian society for their constancy and joy in undergoing trials, and he sheds joyful tears as he recalls their fortitude in leaving their families. This is a fascinating passage. Even now, as I turn over the individual events in my mind, tears erupt spontaneously from my eyes. Now I seem to hear the sweet kisses of the mothers, the warnings of the fathers, now the brother, now the dear sister, all the many things which ingenious love dictates and mixes in, together with calculated weeping among the groans and sighs. Whoever there was, joined by friendship or blood, lays on 1,000 arts, 1,000 wiles, in the attempt to wrest you from your firm resolve, that is, to go into exile as a Jesuit. In another letter to Jesuit youth, to the adolescents who've arrived from the province of Santa Fe, he sings their dangerous sea voyage, their traversing of the Ligurian mountains by foot, their humiliating treatment in Bologna at the hands of Jesuit coadjutors, until they reach safe haven at Gubbio. And it's really described as a sort of via crucis. The implicit alignment of the history of the society with the life and sufferings of Christ is, of course, distinctively Jesuit, and one just needs to think about the Imago Primi Saeculi. Azevedo exhorts his young heroes not to lose courage now, because he often fails in daring who is resting on the plain, he who is able to scale the peaks of mountains. The final letter, which is supplemented with extensive notes, rounds out the collection on a nostalgically heroic note, although it's actually in elegiacs. It's addressed to Azevedo's sweetest friend, Andrés Camacho, and describes the latter's activities as a missionary in Ecuador, bringing the gospel, agriculture, and European building techniques to the barbarian tribes of the Pastaza River. So the poems on the sorrows of the Blessed Virgin and another one on the Sacred Heart need to be read in the light of the fact that Camacho, shortly before the suppression, apparently supervised the building of churches to Our Lady of Sorrows of the Muratas and to the Sacred Heart of Jesus of the Jibaros. I'm not sure whether any remains of these buildings exist. It would be good to consult the architectural historians. This part of America is far from a prelapsarian paradise, however. Water is so warm it seems boiled and doesn't quench the thirst. Meat killed in the morning is rotten by the evening. Tigers do battle with crocodiles, and people live in mortal fear of snakes as long as tall trees. And yet, I should mention that Azevedo, throughout the collection, particularly highlights the homesickness of the American exiles. This is something, of course, which we also see in the Rusticatio Mexicana of Rafael Landívar. The 8th poem in Hexameters is a prophecy for the brothers of the Mexican province, predicting their glorious return to their homeland one day. And in the meantime, they have to be content with Azevedo's recreation of the history and the natural wonders of the New World. However, in the light of my question at the top of my paper as to whether the writing and circulation of Latin verse might in itself serve as a consolation for suppressed Jesuits, I'd like to conclude with a few letters that seem to support that thesis. Not only does Azevedo record the relief that he personally derives from writing poetry, but in several letters he actively invites his brothers to exercise their own muse. Not necessarily, it has to be said, their poetic muse. In the 18th letter, he urges his friend who has apparently complained to him about brothers falling away from the society, mixing with women, and falling into moral turpitude. He says that idleness is the problem, and he needs to encourage scientific study, everyone to his own talents. And then there follows this magnificent 2 or 3 page ekphrasis of everything knowable, every branch of science, including those branches of science that were being versified by the poets of the Collegio Romano. So in a way, it's a kind of modeling of the possibility of scientific didactic poetry. But the 16th letter is really a veritable potted ars poetica for the young Jesuits in exile. And let's not forget that he also published his juvenile Ars Poetica in 2 volumes dedicated to Catherine the Great. This letter, though, is dated 1769, and in it Azevedo corrects the Latin verses apparently sent to him by some aspiring young Jesuit poets in response to one of his previous letters. And thus seems to confirm incidentally that at least some of these poems must have been delivered, although, of course, what we have in the printed version is revised. It contains a rare moment of light relief when the middle-aged poet objects to his virtual students calling him a venerable old man. And he says, when you called me a venerable old man, dum venerandes ex me carmena vestra vocarunt, penna nemisve lox voce nutraque fuit. Your pen was too quick in both descriptions, so neither venerable nor old. And he then indulgently excuses their lapses in Latin. Nay, I am amazed that you have managed to sing when oppressed by such a torrent of troubles. Does the wretch tossed in the midst of the storm sing, or he who is chased by a wolf through the forest? There will be a time when the holy power will give us a happy leisure. A pure, ingenious peace creates poets. And thus, Azevedo looks hopefully to the rebirth of the society and perhaps also to a rebirth of a vigorous and distinctive tradition of Jesuit poetic Latinity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yasmin, for this fascinating paper. Yasmin will take questions, of course, so please raise your hand if you have one.
Did Catherine already provide a refuge for the Jesuits formally when this was written?
Okay, so this was published in 1789, so yes.
You must have,
yes.
because I'm wondering if there was another rhetorical side to this address, persuading her to continue in this path, perhaps, that she had started.
Yeah.
A follow-up question. Is there any explicit reference to the exercises or consolation and desolation from the exercises, or is it more implicit?
That's an excellent question, Claude. And as I say, I've just started dabbling. I've been looking at the things that obviously jump out of the page to me is all this classical stuff. And I've been focusing on the emotions and not so much on the history. Part of the project will, of course, be to identify all the dramatis personae, who they were, what groups they were, whether they also wrote. I don't know, but that would be something that I would be very interested to explore further, perhaps with your guidance.
But why did you ask that question? Why? Yeah.
Well, I'm simply curious about the lack of explicit references to the spiritual exercises in so many areas. We are using the spiritual exercises as a guide to Jesuit education in many ways, or a revision of Jesuit education. And reading the early Jesuit pedagogical writings, I see no explicit allusions to what the exercises tell us to do or how the exercises are structured. There's no modeling on the exercises. So perhaps it was something felt, absorbed, appropriated, and only expresses itself indirectly.
Well, actually, I wonder, though, also with some of those poems where the sufferings of the youth and the exiled Jesuits are they're not metaphors, they parallel the life of Christ, and there's, I suppose, a kind of enargeia, composition of place. I mean, there's a vividness to these accounts that perhaps is reminiscent of, the spiritual exercises. It would be worth looking at that in more detail.
Yeah, it's been excellent stuff. Wonderful, wonderful things. Probably you can't answer, or you can, but Ken Gowans argues that after the sack of Rome, there was a dramatic shift in the humanists' response to the classical world in response to the horrors of the sack of Rome. Have you noticed a shift in the attitude of the Jesuits before and after the suppression to the classical world? I suspect not, from the examples you've given.
Yes, and the one slide that I that I dropped from my presentation was a rather ambitious program of research and different Jesuit poets and prose writers that we've identified for future study. The original aim actually was to create, it's difficult to do this sort of work without making anthologies and editing critical editions, because although a lot is now, of course, available on Google Books, it's not accessible to non-Latin reading public. And I think the value of this material is inestimable. But the original idea for the project was to have a conference and a volume of historical essays, but also to create a kind of annotated anthology of Jesuit writers of the suppression. And I think once we get to that, with long introductory essays, a little bit like Andrew Laird's introduction to the Rusticatio Mexicana, when we get to that point, it will probably be easier to answer your question. The question is also, what is before and after the suppression with Azevedo? If we believe these letters were written in the 1760s, there's no reason not to, yet they're then published now in 1789. Has he gone back to them and revised them in the light of the suppression? I mean, that would be, it would be wonderful to have manuscripts.
Thanks for a wonderful paper, lecture. I wonder if you could talk a bit more about what you were saying in terms of the potentials for Latin versus vernacular writing and expressing emotion. And are there authors who are writing in both and how that might compare?
Yes, well, Azevedo writes in both, actually. Well, he doesn't write any long works in the vernacular, but for example, in the preface to his translated Italian sonnets, he says that there's a value in he values translation, and of course translation is another prong of Jesuit distinctiveness that keeps coming up in the conference. Translation is, although he's done these translations for his own benefit to assuage his sorrows, that translations might be useful for youth, doesn't say Jesuit youth at this point, to show how one can express the energy of one language in another, and that translations are particularly useful for learning foreign languages. So he's not a snob, and I haven't checked, but I remember that in the preface to the Ars Poetica, which is it all Latin poetry? I'll have to check again. Mostly Latin poetry, but I think he has some interesting comments there about the value of vernacular languages as well. And the Spanish-American Jesuits were great. I mean, Brian will know much more about this. They were involved in translations and wrote wonderful Spanish as well, didn't they? So, Basilio da Gama, of course, ex-Jesuit, wrote a Latin poem, perhaps not so well known, on the gold mines of Brazil, which a Portuguese former student of mine edited a few years ago. But of course, he's the poet of Uruguay, a very famous Portuguese poem, epic poem, anti-Jesuit poem. I'm sorry, that probably doesn't answer your question, but I'm not across all these different languages, and that's why I think this project will be a work of many hands. And it's so wonderful to come to a conference like this and I've been hoovering up, do you have the word hoover in America? Vacuuming up bits and pieces, and I think in some ways, I won't say that I'm the Senecan bee, but I feel that I've taken from many flowers over the last few days, and my paper has certainly benefited from your wisdom. I am a bee. The sting.
This is a question that wants to try to get at what the theory of affect that's being assumed by the project. And maybe it just follows from the last question a little bit. Spencer mentioned describe the poetry as expressing emotion. And you've been talking a lot about the writing of the poetry and maybe the reading of the poetry as being therapy, and so compensating rather than expressing. And I was just wondering if you could just say a little bit about what theory of emotions or what theory of affect the project is assuming. And then secondly, what kind of evidence do you consider to be persuasive for confirming the usefulness of that theory of emotions? That
Oh, that's a tricky one because, well, in Rome at Easter, this conference, Feelings Matter, which brought together Italian intellectual historians and, well, international, including me, historians of emotion. There was a lot of talk about theory and, you know, integrating different intellectual historical traditions and, you know, what do the emotion center people think about affect and what, etc. But we are numerous, we are legion, and I'm not, I'm not going to sort of plump for one. I'm not a Rosen-Weiniest or a Reddiest or a this or a thatist. And I am actually a neo-Latinist and a classicist by training, and so I'm looking at these poems through the lens of, I guess, that of a Roman Latin literature intertextualist. So I sort of see myself in a continuum with scholars like Philip Hardy and Joe Farrell and et cetera, et cetera. So how that connects with the history of emotions, I suppose it's just where the focus is. I'm not going to try, I can't prove that Azevedo was expressing true emotions, but I think, you know, if you've got all these poems and they're talking about all these emotions and they're certainly emotionally intense, and there's the historical circumstances of him exchanging these letters, and if we can to some extent prove that they went back and forward, you know, we analyse the discourse with the tools available to us as literary historians and hope for the best.
Just a small question at the end. You said, oh, I'm going to show some images in the beginning, and I think it's so fascinating that you're looking at the suppression not sort of as an end toward the development, but taking it so seriously. Are you going to consider any images in this project as well?
Oh, I'd love to consider images, and if anyone can show me images, there's an open invitation to send me images of the suppression. I mean, all the slides that I've shown you have been taken from the internet, so or I've known about them from, you know, the few books that I've looked at. This final image, I just wanted to mention, I think I might have skipped. I won't start again, don't worry. But I might have just skipped the bit where there's one of the poems is addressed by Azevedo in the persona of Stanislas Kostka, talking to, I'll just see if I can, yes. He addresses this poem, Stanislas Kostka, student of the Society of Jesus, sends greetings to his sweetest fellow students from the American provinces, where he's sending greetings from beyond the grave. And of course, by doing this, Azevedo is invoking this whole tradition of Jesuit Heroides writing, but of course there's also all this wonderful figurative material as well. And yes. So I'll just leave it at that, I think. That's of course, well, I'm sure you all recognize that's from Jean Vincar's Sacralum Heroidum Epistolae. That's a 17th century work.
I was wondering, I thought you mentioned early on also the existence of diaries.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if there's any way to sort of think through the ways in which the diary accounts of either events or emotions represented or not represented in those diaries accord with then these other forms or genres.
Yes.
Is it seems like that might be a way of triangulating
Absolutely.
some of these, and then you might get to questions about movements across languages, and then, you know, what gets suppressed or what gets expressed. And you'd also have ways of triangulating against real events that might be occurring in time.
Yes, I think that's a very good point. Non omnia possumus omnes. But I think that's a very good suggestion. And of course, you know, if you come across such diaries, that I'm sure there are thousands that I won't know about. Obviously, I would be most interested at looking at those that relate to Azevedo's addressees, and if one could compare the diaries with the poems, that would be absolutely fascinating, actually.
Please join me to thank Yasmin for this wonderful, wonderful lecture.